Yeah, so if you look at the first panel, you can see Garfield. He's shaking a lot. Like there's like
That's like
some
unhealthy. Yeah,
there's a lot of lines drawn around him to indicate that he's shaking.
good one.
He's holding a green mug that appears to be filled with a black liquid, and some of said black liquid is spilled on the table.
Yeah, Garfield is not shaking in a healthy condition. Like,
Yeah,
like it's not healthy. And then in the second panel, he's doing the same thing. It's like the same, but more coffee is like splashing out of his green mug, and John's like, "Is that coffee too strong, Garfield?" Well, no, he just said, "Is that coffee too strong?" Well, now we know it's
yeah, and
coffee.
John isn't impressed with Garfield's behavior. He thinks Garfield's drinking a bit too much coffee, and he's kind of disappointed in Garfield.
But now we know that it's coffee, so we can assume that he is over-caffeinated. But
Yeah,
now, the third panel is kind of scary, man. So, he screams with his mind, because he talks with his mind, but John can understand. He doesn't actually telepathically communicate with John, just to be clear. That's just like how his text is represented.
yeah,
And he screams, "No!" And John flies backwards, as indicated by his red socks and blue pants in that third panel.
yeah. Now this joke is pretty funny because it's indicating that Garfield's response was very exaggerated as to what it normally would have been due to the immense amounts of caffeine that Garfield has just consumed.
Okay, this panel kind of
Pretty amazing.
scares me for like a few reasons. One, like, look at John's toes. That is not very. That's like one toe on each foot. That's kind of
Yes.
That's kind of terrifying. And Garfield's ears are not cleanly attached to his head, which might have been one of the reasons that he was shaking. He was scared because his ears were not attached to his body, and he was ready for them to fall off.
Yes.
Anyway, that's some scary crap, man. Let's.
What do you rate it out of 10?
Out of 10, I'd give this a solid 7 out of 10, just because
I give it a 7.1.
it has a scary jump scare at the end that
Yeah.
really had the rest of us like what a twist. Anyway,
It had me
let's move on-
shaking.
Let's move on to the next one. Now, in this first panel, Garfield's looking very confident, like he knows what he's talking about. He has one finger pointed up in the air, which indicates that he's going to explain something to us, or that he knows something we don't. And he's saying, "The best things in life are free." This is some pretty good knowledge, in my opinion.
Yeah. In the next panel, we can see Garfield. He looks pretty not impressed. He looks like he looks kind of bored.
He looks
right?
kind of disappointed.
Yeah. He looks like he's in a bad mood. And he says, "And so are the worst things."
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's really leaving us hanging. But then,
Yeah.
the third panel is what really brings it all home. When Garfield stretches out his arms in surprise, and he says, "It's the stuff in between that's expensive." And
Yeah.
that's like that's a funny punchline for this joke.
This is a pretty funny joke because Garfield is acknowledging the fact that everything is pretty expensive now, and it's also a play on the commonly used phrase, "The best things in life are free," and it's really clever play on the phrase by Garfield.
Yeah, and it seems like a thing Garfield would say, which he has.
Yeah, I'd give this one a 6.
I'd give this one a 6 too, because there's no outside characters, and that kind of disappoints me. Because I like the outside characters.
Yes.
Anyway, let's move on to the next one.
Next, Garfield.
This is Dear Ask a Dog. For those of you who are not known Garfield fans, Ask a Dog is a series in Garfield that pops up once in a while, where Garfield's reading a thing that's like, he's reading a question that people send in to Dear Ask a Dog about, and Odie is there, and Odie does some funny response.
Yeah, so we can see Garfield reading off a paper in this panel too, which, Garfield, he's pretty lazy. He's not going to memorize his lines, right?
Yeah.
So, in our second panel, we can see Garfield in the same pose, and Odie seems to be responding to the question Garfield asks, which is, "When you howl, are you singing?" Which is a reference to the fact that dogs like to howl for some reason.
Yes, but
Because of their natural wolf-like instincts.
Odie is perked up at this. He notices something, unlike the first panel where he looks rather bored. Garfield still looks rather bored, but that's just Garfield for you. Anyway,
What a guy,
in the
Garfield.
third panel, Odie does like one of those like Netflix TV show type things, and he like breaks out in a song like "Aru." But I don't think that's a very good song. There's better songs out there, man. But
Yeah,
he
so
has a microphone too, which I don't know where he got that from, and I don't really want to know. And
yeah,
Garfield still looks very disappointed. His
yeah,
hands are in that I had to do it to him position
yeah.
over the paper, and he says that would be a no, even though
So you can
Yes.
see Garfield's put down the paper too, showing that he's pretty disappointed, and his reaction, that would be a no, is a subtle reference to the fact that Odie's howling did not sound very melodious, and was in fact probably a very irritating sound for
but it was
Garfield.
still partially sarcastic. Because
But
judging by the
especially-
microphone and the way that Odie is positioned, that Odie actually does think that he is singing.
Yes. Especially, this is probably especially irritating Garfield, because cats have very sensitive ears and very sensitive hearing, and Garfield is probably in some sort of pain from this, and he's losing his balance probably too, as your ears are an important part of your balance system. So Garfield's really not enjoying this.
Yeah, this is. I'd rate this one a solid 7.5, 7.6.
Yeah, I give it an 8 because it's a solid joke, and there's good character uses, and the character development is amazing.
Yes, the character development, my favorite part of all Garfield. Anyway,
Next
we have
thing.
like 4 left, so let's go
Yep.
on to this one. Garfield looks very smug in this first panel, and he's holding what appears to be a smoothie or soda, but we'll get to that later. And he says,
Yeah.
fun facts. Now, if you've ever watched any of these life hack or fun fact videos, some of them have some pretty good stuff in them. And
Yeah.
since it's Garfield,
I
which
saw
is a very
a thing about how
credible
you-
source, we can assume that it'll be good.
One time I saw a thing about how you can turn a beach towel into pants. How useful is that? That's so useful. And Garfield, he's about to teach us an amazing life tip that we're going to use in our everyday lives.
Yeah. Now, the second panel, there isn't much to see. Garfield seems to be aggressively sucking on the straw, which produces a slurk noise. And
Yeah.
as you can see by this little bit of spit that's coming off, he is very aggressively slurking the soda, if you would like to
Yeah.
refer to it that way.
Garfield's face in this panel is a reference to the fact that he is, in fact, consuming the soda through a straw, which is a funny, subtle commentary on plastic straws being banned in the state of California.
Ha ha ha. That's my
Jim
favorite.
Davis always likes to write subtle political commentary into his comic, and
Yeah.
I think that's great.
The third panel really has the true Garfield spirit, and I said we get to what's in the cup later, and this is where Garfield comes in, because it says gravy can be classified as a beverage, which is a subtle reference to the fact that Garfield likes to eat somewhat fatty foods, and he doesn't like to eat healthy foods, and gravy is generally not considered to be that healthy of a food. Consider the
Yes.
things that it is put on, like turkey.
In addition to that, gravy is also somewhat thick of, not really, I wouldn't class the gravy as a liquid personally. Which means that Garfield, which if we go back to the second panel, we can see that Garfield is very aggressively sucking on the straw, which he needs to do because the beverage is in fact gravy, and gravy is a lot more thick
We
than
can see that
normal
Garfield's
beverages.
very pleased by his discovery. He is very happy at what he's come across. I'd give this one a solid 6.5, just because there wasn't that much character usage, but it was really it really changed my view on the world.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with you there. The subtle political commentary makes me think this one is a 9. So that's my opinion, though.
I thought it would have been better. I thought it would have been around there if there were more extra characters. Like even John
Yes.
just being surprised in the second panel would be fine for me.
Yes.
Now let's go on this next one. This one's kind of funny because I actually saw this one in the paper while my dad was reading it. You see, in the first panel, this female pink cat named Arlene, if you have done your Garfield lore research, which as Garfield professional reviewers we have, and she goes,
Yeah.
It was probably sound in a lower or in a higher or lower pitch based on the character who was speaking it, but since it is me, I will not do voices.
Yeah,
And
and we cannot know the character's voice pitch as well, just because it is written language and not spoken language.
We can hear that it is somewhat shrill based on the shaky letters that have been illustrated. And it was a very loud noise based on how big of the speech panel it was.
Yes, and judging by Garfield's reaction, Garfield doesn't enjoy this noise. Like, his hairs are sticking up. You can see he's like obviously jostled by it. His eyes are a bit off. His hands up.
It's like the same reaction as Odie when he tried to howl and sing.
Yeah. So Garfield. So judging by that, we can infer that this noise is very unpleasant to Garfield's ears. And as we've mentioned before, cats have very sensitive hearing, so this is even more so for Garfield.
Yeah. You see, in the second panel now, she looks pleased and is turning back towards Garfield, saying, Do you think I have a good yowling voice? And Garfield, having a very wide smile, which we can deem to be sarcastic based on the first panel where he is clearly not enjoying it, is very happy, although Arlene would not know that he was not truly enjoying the thing that she has done. And
Garfield is attempting... Garfield is quite obviously making an attempt. I think Garfield is trying to pretend that he enjoyed this because he's trying to impress Arlene for whatever reason.
Yes.
Yep. And then we can see in the next panel, Garfield, he's talking to his teddy bear Pookie, and he says, then I pretended to get a phone call. Garfield looks very disinterested. So this is a pretty good joke.
One of the first things that we can take from this is that Garfield was in fact telling a story based on the sudden setting change and the 3 dots before a sentence. And we can also, and this is also a very nice joke because a very cliche thing to do is to say that you're getting a phone call in order to get out of an unpleasant or unwanted conversation.
Yeah, so Garfield, he's pretty smart and he's pretty clever, right? So he uses this common trick to avoid having to listen to more of those obnoxious noises. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'd rate this one a solid 9, just because of the very diverse character inclusion, the amazing twist and multiple cliches included into this to make it an overall enjoyable comic.
I have to rate it a 9.5 out of 10, just because I really appreciate Garfield satirizing the cliches, as well as Garfield's. This really shows Garfield's intelligence in the best possible way, and that is something that we don't see very often in Garfield.
Yes, this is probably our highest rated comic for this week.
Yeah.
Now we have 2 more comics here, and the next one is Garfield, looking very bored, given that his head is resting on his hand, is leaning
and his eyes are his eyelids are closed most of the way, so he's more than half asleep. He is just ready to go to sleep right now.
Yeah,
he's not having fun.
But there's a spider who's he's looking very lively, and is speaking to Garfield. I was born to dance. You see, this is somewhat confusing because we have no context for the joke yet. Yeah.
So we can see in the next panel, Garfield is still in the same pose, still really, really bored. The spider hasn't moved either. We can't judge the spider's facial expression, so we don't know exactly what the spider's feeling, because Jim Davis has chosen not to draw the spider's facial expression, which is annoying for theorizing potentially what he is feeling. But Garfield says, "No, you weren't," which is a subtle reference to the fact that Garfield does not agree with the spider's previous statement in the last panel.
I would also side with Garfield given the context that he has currently been given. I have never seen a spider dance. They just kind of crawl around on my ceilings and look creepy until they get swatted with a newspaper, which Garfield has shown that he likes to do in several other comics.
Yeah.
Overall, I'd say Garfield's feelings on spiders are mixed, because sometimes he communicates with the spiders and talks to them as he's doing in this comic, and other times he brutally swats them with a newspaper, causing death.
Yeah. So, look, in the next panel, we can see Garfield looks startled, and the spider is waving around one of his, or like 4, 6, it's difficult to tell from the drawing that Jim Davis has here.
Yes.
He's waving his legs around, and Garfield is startled by this action, and the spider says, "Then what's with all these feet?" So this is a clever callback to the first panel where the spider says he was born to dance, and it's also a clever callback to the second panel when Garfield doubts that. So the spider is reprimanding Garfield's doubt in that he has many feet, 8 to be precise, which is more than the average living organism has feet.
I'm gonna have to disagree with you there, though, because if you count the feet in the first panels, you can clearly see that he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, which makes me tend to disagree with Jim Davis's knowledge of spiders. Although he is very knowledgeable, but I do not think so when it comes to spiders.
Well, maybe Jim Davis is trying to create a cartoon caricature of the spider because in his beautiful universe of Garfield, spiders only have 6 legs.
Yes, I would like
That's
to.
just a theory.
Yes.
But the spider waving around his feet. Back to what we were saying earlier. The spider, he's waving around. He has a lot of feet, and he thinks that means that he can dance better. Now, there's another subtle reference in the lower right, left-hand corner of this third panel. You see Jim Davis 420. That's a subtle nod to the fact this was written on April 20th, which is
the day that marijuana was legalized.
It's March 20th. Yeah, so this was written on March 20th, and this is pretty funny
20th.
joke.
It is April 20th.
Oh shit, yeah, it is April 20th. Yeah, this is a pretty funny joke. Yeah, that's a subtle reference. I'm gonna rate one a 7. The joke in itself isn't that strong, but the subtle reference in the lower left-hand corner adds a lot of depth to the strip overall.
I would say that overall, I would give this strip an 8.5, me disagreeing with you, Rafferty, because of all these subtle references about how it is hard to dance when you do not move your feet, or the subtle nod to the day that marijuana was legalized, and lots of other subtle references. And I thought it had very good character diversity. He does not understand the concept of the spider all that well, but he includes him very thoroughly in his comic, and I would like to acknowledge that.
Yes. Alright.
Finally, our last comic, onto our Sunday comic.
Alright, so normally when you're reading the Sunday comic, you skip over the title panel. The title panel is there for new readers to the paper to identify what comic they're reading, just because it's really, if you're on the comics page and you don't know what comic you're reading, well, that's just no fun. But you see, Jim Davis likes to draw a new title panel for every week of Garfield, which adds a lot of variety. So you can see in the left, it says Garfield.com, which is a subtle nod to the website that Jim Davis uses to upload his comics on.
Yes.
And we can see in the title panel, Garfield is lying down on some letters that spell out his own name, which is Garfield. Garfield's name is Garfield, yes. Surprising.
Really?
And you can see that his food, there's an empty food bowl resting on top of the L and the D, and there appears to be some spilled food around it. And Garfield looks very satisfied. He also has some, you can see in his mouth, he looks like he's just eaten food. So we can infer from this that Garfield is satisfied as he has just eaten the food, which was formerly in the food bowl, before this scene takes place. Alright, so on to the actual first panel. We can see John. John looks kind of angry. John is somewhat agitated, or anticipating something to happen.
They both seem rather suspicious.
Yeah. So Garfield here, he looks pretty bored. He looks rather disinterested. He's got his trademark, like, very close to falling asleep look. And there's a donut between the two of them, and both of them appear to be looking at that donut.
Yes, the donut is appearing to be a chocolate donut with pink frosting, which is a very enjoyable kind of donut to eat. Now, overall, the panels don't change that much in this strip, except for towards the end. Now, the panels don't really, the characters don't really change in the second panel, but John is saying...
Well, in the second panel, you can see Garfield he's focused his eyes more on the donut. You can see his head's down a little bit more.
Same with John. And John is saying, "Look, Garfield, only one donut left." He seems rather disappointed like this, like what's going to happen. Now, that's all really for that panel. But on the next panel, Garfield adjusts his gauge to look up more at John, seeming rather more interested in what John is saying.
Yeah,
But John
Garfield
seems,
is doing this as a reference to the fact that Garfield is this is Jim Davis showing the reader that Garfield is paying attention to what John is saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
and John is looking rather more disappointed, realizing the fact that he is saying something that would make him sad, because he is saying, if you ate it, I'd feel sad because I didn't get any. No, being left out is never a pleasant experience. I know personally that being left out is never a pleasant experience, and John does not want to feel this experience, but he has a feeling Garfield will make him feel it anyway deep down in his heart. Now,
Yeah.
in the next panel, nothing really changes except for what John is saying, which is, if I ate it, I'd feel guilty because you didn't get any. Which is
Yeah,
kind of
this
the
is-
role, but reversed because he doesn't want Garfield to be left out either.
John is expressing that either visible option, the two most obvious options here, leave one person feeling unsatisfied with the scenario, and that is not an optimal situation. And John is trying to propose a way to, not have to deal with it. In the next panel, John says, "So consider this." So he's about to start describing a solution where both parties are satisfied with the results of the debate.
As you can see,
Argument thing.
his hand is lifted up with one finger pointing upward. As we covered in a previous strip, this means that Garfield's about to... John. Yes, John. Garfield is still looking in the same gaze at John, which doesn't change until the last panel. But John is holding one finger up, which shows that he is about to say some knowledge to Garfield and to the rest of us viewing audience. You see, now I have a theory from the last panel, which is that John gathered counsel, him and Garfield, so that none of them would feel disappointed over what happens to the donut. John wanted to solve this, civilly. He didn't want anyone to be left out.
Yes.
But, as you can see in the second to last panel, he says, if we shared it, I'd be happy that we both got some. John's trying to share the donut, but Garfield still seems disinterested. But John seems really thrilled by the idea, given his wide-eyed, smiling mouth expression and how he's leaning forward with his arms wrapped across his chest.
Yep. So, he's enthusiastic about a solution, too. So, in the next panel, we can see that the first thing that's most obvious is that the donut is no longer in place, and instead there are a few crumbs. So, John looks less enthusiastic, so we can infer that this happened rather quickly, the disappearance of the donut, as John's arm is still in the same position. He just looks less enthused about what happened. And we can see Garfield. The trail of crumbs leads to him, and his mouth looks full, which is a hint to the reader that Garfield has in fact consumed this donut. And Garfield says, "It's always about you, isn't it?" Now, I think this is really clever on Jim Davis's part, because it is irony, because Garfield has just done something that is very selfish to do. He's eaten the whole donut instead of accepting John's polite offer to share the donut. And Garfield is accusing John of being selfish here, which I think is hilarious and truly an amazing joke.
I feel what Garfield did was out of line, because John had just called this council in order to make sure that they both were happy, but then Garfield has gone out of line, disrupted the council, and eaten the last donut. As you can infer by the second panel, that it was the last donut.
Yes. Now, to our young viewers out here, we do not recommend that you behave this way, and we recommend that you respect other people because they are pretty cool too.
Sharing is caring.
Yes.
I would rate this comic a solid... I'd rate it a solid 8, just because I liked all the jokes, and I liked the expressions that John made, but I also thought the thing that Garfield did was rotten.
Yeah. I rated it a 7. I appreciate the jokes and humor. It's very humorous. The only reason I wouldn't rate it higher is because I don't feel like Garfield should be encouraging this behavior to young readers.
Yeah. Now, what would you rate What'd you rate the week overall? What'd you rate the week overall?
I have to give this week a 7. It was pretty strong. We had some particularly strong ones, some weaker ones, but
Yeah.
for the most part, they were all pretty good.
I'd rate this a 9 just because the very um, subtle reference here in the spider comic in the bottom left corner of the third panel. I thought that was a really good reference to
Mm,
something.
yeah.
And yeah, I thought this was a really good week for Garfield.